They laughed before they saw the contrails. In briefings across airfields in occupied Europe, some Luftwaffe pilots chuckled at the rumor. The Americans were sending black fighter pilots into combat. The idea wasn't just dismissed, it was mocked, with an easy certainty that made the derision feel like destiny. Skill, discipline, combat nerve. These were the preserve of men already decorated, already sure of themselves. What threat could come from those the enemy assumed had had no place in a cockpit? And yet, in the cold, thinning air above Europe, reputations didn't matter. Motors did. Tactics did. Nerves did. On certain days, the sky over Germany sounded like metal arguing with gravity. V-12s and radial engines roared at full climb. Bombers droned in unbreakable patterns. Fighters, stacked in cover formations, glittered like needles in sunlit altitudes. Somewhere in those layered stacks of aluminum and resolve, red paint-bright tail assemblies traced a terse promise across the day. We are here to keep these bombers alive. The mocked pilots, the red tails, would turn jokes into a battle plan. They would be called cautious by those who misunderstood what their job required, and relentless by those who learned too late what red tails meant at the edge of range. When you gamble the future on mockery, your odds are already wrong. Before the Luftwaffe learned to stop laughing, a different argument raged stateside. It was quieter, colder, and bureaucratic. The United States, fighting for freedom abroad, argued at home over whether black Americans could handle complex aircraft, over whether they could manage the calculus of flight, lift and drag, energy and angle, discipline and fear. So a test was arranged, a separate unit, its destiny fenced by prejudice and paperwork. They built an airfield at Tuskegee, Alabama. Heat rose off the runways in ripples. The instructors' voices cut through prop wash and habit. And into this, young men carried iron that had nothing to do with engines. It was the iron of patience, the iron of not answering back to the way a country could look at them and refuse to see them. They learned checklists until the words felt carved into muscle. They learned to treat weather like a willful animal and altitude like a bank account. They learned that a fighter pilot's most dangerous opponent is the story he tells himself about what the enemy can't do. In their case, they faced a different danger, what their own side insisted they couldn't do. The Tuskegee Airmen learned anyway. Instructors repeated themselves until voices were hoarse. Taxi discipline, takeoff spacing, gentle on the throttle, respect the prop, respect the wing, respect the machine. Your life is a thread stretched between seconds. Do not fray it with ego. The trainees pressed pencils to paper. Navigation problems, fuel calculations, the angles of approach. In the air, they learned the simple, deadly geometry of a merge. They learned that the world narrows to sightlines and seconds when an enemy slides across the canopy glass. They learned formation like it was a wordless oath. Watch your lead. Watch your wingman. Watch the bombers. Weapons training came last, a hush before the noise. The first time tracers drew a red-orange seam into the practice targets, they felt the airplane speak back through the weapons, a humming buzz through thighs and forearms, the machine turning feral for the instant you pulled the trigger. Targets shattered, confidence hardened, and there was still, beneath it all, the quiet fury. We'll be perfect, because you told us we couldn't be good. Orders arrived. Europe beckoned. Italy's airfields waited like scarred knuckles thrust out over the Mediterranean. The war had erased subtlety. Men lived out of tents and ate dusted bread. You could smell oil in the wind. Across the runway, the ground crews were already the difference between living and not. They swarmed over aircraft with a kind of affection that looked like work. Safety wiring, torquing, refitting, testing. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group felt the last doubts fall away in the roar of unfamiliar engines and the weight of the first real mission brief. Their commander's doctrine was simple enough to write down and hard enough to live out. Be disciplined. Hold the escort. Don't be tempted. The mission is the bombers. Somewhere north, the Luftwaffe waited with experience and reputation. Those reputations flew Bf-109s and FW-190s, machines with crisp, hard edges and pilots hardened by the Eastern Front. They would not yield their dominance easily, and the Red Tails did not ask permission. The first fights weren't glamorous. They were chaotic. Combat ground truth is always messier than briefing room diagrams. Clouds came and went like curtains. Sun angles lied. Radios crackled with voices that suddenly sounded very young. They learned how it feels to watch a bomber stagger when 20mm shells find it, how the formation tightens to protect a damaged straggler, how every escort pilot fights the urge to chase the enemy that made that sudden, ugly hole in the sky. They learned what the word discipline looks like when you can see the enemy crossing your nose and your thumb hangs above the trigger and your orders say, "Not yet. Hold." They learned that living long enough to get better is the enemy's first gift and last mistake. You can only underestimate someone once. Then you have to survive what they become after that. The Red Tails began to earn the reputation their commander wanted, predictably disciplined in an unpredictable war. They sheltered bombers into and out of target areas. They held the weave on the edges of the boxes, vigilant and deliberate. They amped their heads on swivel, scanning contrails and sun. They started to log victories not in bursts of glory, but in the monotonous miracle of bomber groups returning with more airplanes than the Luftwaffe thought possible. And when they did fight, they fought with a tactician's patience. No nonsense, no solo heroics. They preferred to fight with the altitude advantage, with the sun where it hurt the enemy most, with timing that forced German pilots into defensive turns that bled speed and options. If the trap didn't look clean, they didn't spring it. They weren't there to chase. They were there to deny. The Luftwaffe noticed that the Red Tails didn't scatter. Interceptions that had become routine hunts began to feel uncertain, even costly. Arrogance is a habit, and like all habits, it cracks first at the edges. Paint changed more than paint. When the vertical stabilizers went red, it wasn't vanity. It was identification, cohesion, and a rumor that turned into a warning. Bomber crews began to ask for them by sight instead of call sign. The ground crews buffed out bullet nicks and repainted the flaking bright red with a kind of defiance, a declaration you could see from 1,000 yards. This is an escort that sticks. Stories spread. Some were true, some were better than true, but all carried a core of hard fact. The Red Tails didn't flinch in the turn to cover a bomber's blind side. They weren't the loudest on the radio. They didn't shop for kills at the edge of their orders. Their victories arrived like the end of an argument. Escort doesn't make you famous, it makes you necessary. They learned to time their fuel to the minute. They learned to count the squeeze of minutes before the bomb bay doors opened and the world below became a geometry of explosions. They learned to live with the sound of engines laboring back on 3, on 2, leaking coolant and hope. They learned that turning your back on a damaged bomber to chase a threat sometimes feels like treason, even when it isn't. They earned their kills the hard way. Opportunistic, disciplined, often in defense of something slower and more fragile than themselves. They carved away at the Luftwaffe's margin of success by denying the easy intercept, by blocking the fast dive, by making a German pilot waste his limited ammunition in hurried shots at a bomber's armored back while the Red Tails set up the real shot, the one that ends the argument. And then a new sound arrived above Europe, the sound of the jet age, high and distant and unnatural. It looked like a streak that disobeyed propeller logic and returned to base faster than bad news. The Luftwaffe had introduced the world's first operational jet fighters. It would take months for the sky to teach the range of their strengths and the outline of their weaknesses. The red tails would learn faster than most. They learned to live inside thin margins, of time, of fuel, of patience. The weather did not negotiate. Neither did the enemy. In briefings, they spoke about Big Week, that storm of February raids when American heavy bombers and their escorts hammered aircraft factories and assembly lines. Most of those missions tore out of England, but the 15th Air Force in Italy pressed its own relentless rhythm. Regensburg, Steyr, Wiener Neustadt, Ploiești, targets stitched across the map like old scars, and the red tails, still carving their name into a skeptical war, tightened straps and flew. The ground crews worked into the cold blue hours, fingers numb under the weight of wrenches, paint scuffed from cowls, oil pooled in pans, a slick black mirror to the men bending over open engine bays. At Ramatelli, the crosswinds had a voice, always speaking through the canvas tents, rattling dishes, rattling nerves. They ate fast, slept shorter, learned not to argue with the dawn. Discipline wasn't flair. It didn't make headlines. It was a quiet budget of choices, one after another, paid in attention and restraint. Stay with the bombers. The order felt like a promise at first. Later, it hardened into doctrine. That discipline would decide who lived to complain, who lived to fly the next day, and who didn't live at all. The Luftwaffe had bled through 1943, but what remained was sharper, meaner, ruthless in economy. They moved assets to where the pain hurt most. Against the bombers, against the escorts, against anything that made gasoline burn and factories hum. Each time the red tails rose to altitude, the horizon pulled thin and white, and the land below became abstract, as if Europe were no longer a geography, but a geometry of danger. They learned what not to chase. They learned how long a minute could be when the contrails braided and bomber formations climbed like slow cathedrals into flak. And they learned the limits of engines and hands and eyes. Pilots counted not just rounds and fuel, they counted luck. Ramatelli's strip was cut by winds that didn't forgive sloppy inputs. Takeoff was a negotiation with physics, the runway a chalk line between order and oblivion. Wheels up, gear retracted with the industrial clatter, the sky opened like a problem set. No one said it out loud, but nerves were sharper on crosswind mornings. The daily miracles began there, inches off the dirt. They linked into flights, and flights into squadrons, 4 here, 4 there, weaving a net near the bombers. The B-17s and B-24s lumbered north, bellies full of high explosive and fuel, their prop arcs carving silver plates in the air. The escorts drifted between them and threat, a restless, breathing shield. Steel had its own language. It spoke in rivets and vibration, in how the stick trembled when the wings went heavy with speed. Across Austria, beyond the isochrones of fuel reserves, they laid out patterns they had rehearsed over and over. The wisdom of repetition became a point of pride. You don't improvise under flak. You don't daydream where steel has a mind of its own. The Luftwaffe baited them, sometimes with a pair of fighters, angling just outside easy reach. The trick was as old as hunting. Draw the escorts off, isolate the bombers, then strike them in the ribs. The red tails didn't take the bait. Not most days. Temptation made a noise on the radio, a less formal voice, an edge on a word. That was when leaders cut through, steady and clean. Stay with the heavies. No drama, no room for debate. Winds above the Alps broke formations and stitched them back together. Ice sculpted the wings and chewed at lift. Every pilot learned to feel the aircraft through gloves and fear. They learned to reinterpret the physics with their bodies, to ride the edge where speed and weight pushed back against wishes. And in that tension, inside the roar and whistle, each man felt his own judgment grow heavier, more consequential. The rumor flew first. Jets. Me-262s, swept lines, shark mouths of intakes, speeds that didn't sound real. Some dismissed it. Others sharpened their vigilance. Then someone saw one. A flick of silver cutting across the high noon like a thrown blade. No prop disc, no prop sound, just the peculiar thunder of turbines. The first time the jets passed through the formation, they were less fighters than meteors. A pair of them slashed down the bomber stream, liberated from the drag of pistons and props. Defensive fire from the heavies stitched dark chains through the air, late and wide. The jets climbed and outpaced pursuit, converting outrage into helpless awe. Pilots who had never felt slow in a P-51 felt slow that day. The talk in the tents ran hot and clinical. How do you fight what can outrun you flat? You don't, someone said. You meet it where speed isn't king, on landing and takeoff. In the turn if they get greedy. When the jets bled energy. When the turbines lagged between throttle and thrust. The air itself became a chessboard. Squares of vulnerability, where even the fastest piece must step briefly. They practiced vertical separations. They put a premium on sight discipline. No one wanted to be the pilot who chased a jet into flak, or who blew through fuel reserves for a clean miss. The old instincts, the churn of dogfighting, the desire to press, ran up against the cool arithmetic of survival in the jet age. The men learned to be patient. They learned to let the sky come to them. What surprised them most was not the speed. It was the way a new machine could rearrange morale. The Luftwaffe took pride in their miracle weapon. The Allies took pride in their refusal to be awed. The jets would come, and someone would be waiting. Berlin had its own weather, its own gravity of myth. The city was the beating heart, and the cracked mask of the Reich, defended by rings of flak that rose like iron trees. The mission orders felt heavier in the hand that morning. The bombers would go the distance, and the red tails would hold their promise like a line drawn across the day. The trap wasn't a clever ruse on a map. It was simpler. Discipline as bait. The enemy expected the escorts to peel away when fighters flashed by, to chase the lure, to leave the herd exposed. Instead, the red tails leaned closer to the bombers. They formed a second skin, a red-tinged aura that dared the enemy to come through. The jets came anyway, stitching the sky in long, clean dives. Flak thickened until the air felt granular, until sound carried differently. Muffled, then sharp, through the black flowers, through the vibrating ribs of the aircraft. Through the streaming contrails they saw the silhouettes, and then the sudden gleam of metal at impossible speeds. The trick was to erase panic. Watch the angle. Watch the angle. The jets would have to adjust to align their shot. In that tiny pivot, a breath in the throttle lag, there was a window. The red tails moved in layers, some hugging the bombers, others just high and just wide, waiting to roll and meet energy with energy. When the first jet overshot, a Mustang slid into position like an answer and fired a short, disciplined burst. Not anger, not luck. A calculation fulfilled. The Berlin mission would be written in claims and counterclaims, in the heat of memory and the coolness of records. But what the men carried away was simpler. They had gone to the core of the enemy's house, kept their faith with the bombers, and met the future head-on. In the evening, the weather at Ramitelli felt different. The wind smelled of distances closed. Men whispering about rat catchers were not speaking of rodents. They meant waiting near jet fields, at the edge of courage and the edge of fuel, for the precise minutes when turbines surrendered their invincibility. On climb-out, on final approach, the two places where even a predator obeys gravity like everyone else. Finding the fields took maps and luck, and the patient attention of scouts. Once identified, the tactic required an even harder commodity: restraint. You couldn't loiter long without risking a return you wouldn't survive. You couldn't enter the traffic pattern and live. You had to cut angles across it, taste the timing, And timing lives in the hands more than the head. The first time they watched a jet commit to its landing, there was a silence on the radio. Everyone felt the pull to chase, to see the new machine up close, as if speed itself had a scent. Instead, they worked the geometry. A lead called the roll, another called the speed. They winged over, not into the pattern, but across the end of it, where speed meets dirt, where options narrow. A short burst at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Then a climb, shallow and purposeful, out of the gun tower's arcs. It wasn't glamorous. It was effective. The jet fields grew nervous, then cagey. They posted their own guardians, long-nosed protectors sweeping the ends, sharp-tongued, angry. The game changed again, as games do. The red tails adapted again, as men must. More than tactics, it was temperament. To wait. To listen to the spine tell the hands when to move. To be ready for the one pass that mattered. Radios carried more than words. They carried fear in clipped syllables. They carried joy as a joke, tossed too loud, too fast. They carried the sound of a man reaching for control of his own breath. On the channel, call signs mingled with the thud of oxygen masks and the hiss of life at altitude. In combat, the channel filled with teeth, the edges of voices, flaked with urgency. Leaders carved clarity from the noise. 2, tighten. 3, keep high cover. 4, I have your low. Nothing poetic. The poetry was in the spacing, in the timing of replies. When someone saw a jet, it arrived as a word stripped to wire. Fast, 10 high, diving. Then, the numbers, the cardinal points, the altitudes, the clock face of threat translated to the clock face of survival. What did discipline sound like? It sounded like someone not taking the bait. It sounded like someone asking for a recheck on fuel and meaning it. It sounded like backup, like I have you, and I am with you, and break now. Words you could step on like stones when the river ran cold and hard. They invented their own slang under the pressure, as people do in small tribes. But the meaning never strayed far from the essentials. Place, time, threat, response. The chatter from the enemy sometimes bled across, ghost voices in a language most did not understand, full of anger, full of pride. In the end, radios were only a technology. What mattered was that their users had agreed, long before takeoff, what to value when choice collapsed into seconds. War leaves behind stories that shine and stories that bruise. Some claims glow brighter in memory than they do on paper. In the years after, an idea took deep root that the red tails never lost a bomber under their escort. The sentiment held a truth about discipline and care. The literal claim met the cooler diligence of records. The ledgers say some bombers were lost while the red tails guarded them. Dozens across a long campaign where flak, weather, and enemy fighters made every route uncertain. But the ledgers also say this: their loss rate, compared with many other groups, was notably lower. Their escorts were steady, their choices conservative when it mattered most. Crews in bombers spoke about the calm that settled when they saw red on tails, a calm that was not superstition, but experience. Metrics tell us something. They tally sorties, victories, losses, days flown. They give context to bravery. But metrics alone fail to measure the flavor of a certain kind of courage. The courage to sublimate the chase for personal glory into the duller, harder work of protection. That kind of courage rarely seduces the camera. It shows up in absence, the bomber that didn't fall, the families that didn't receive a telegram that week. Myths can be harmful when they erase complexity. They can also be aspirational, a collective way of pointing at what we think excellence looks like. The truth that endured was this: the red tails proved that skill and discipline are not a function of skin, of prejudice, of the poverty of other people's imaginations. They proved it on mission after mission, where the only standard that mattered was whether men came home. Home was not a place so much as a test. The war had clarified certain things. In the cockpit, gravity did not ask about the color of your hands. The ground forces that fueled and armed the planes did their jobs, or they did not, and success depended on the same rude standard. In America, the old questions waited with small-town tenacity. Doors half-opened, eyes measured and then mismeasured. A nation struggled to recognize what it had asked from these men and what it owed them in return. Some returned to study. Some stayed in uniform. The Air Corps would become the Air Force, and the sky would grow stranger with each passing year. Awards were pinned. Names were mispronounced. Applause sometimes came layered with doubt. Yet, the men carried themselves with a solidity forged at altitude. They knew what they had done. They knew, in the private rooms of memory, who had looked back at them in the mirror each morning before a mission, and how they had answered that gaze. Families learned the new shape of their veterans. Wives and mothers and sons navigated the small explosions of daily life as the war receded outward. Routines grew around quiet rituals. The way a father looked at the sky when a plane passed, as if it were an old friend who'd moved away. The way an engine noise could pull a man out of a conversation and set him traveling inside. Not trauma exactly, not always, but the residue of intensity, the echo of responsibility that had once been minute by minute. History books place the end neatly. A date, a signature, a photograph of men sitting at a table. But for the pilots and crews who had lived in the sky, the war ended as rivers do, by widening into the sea, dissolving distinction. The news came, the missions stopped. The machinery of combat grew quiet. Yet inside, the alertness did not vanish on command. Nor did the structures that had once told them no. They found, sometimes, that peace required a different strength. To argue for a position, to hold a professional line, to ask for fairness in rooms that grew prickly when fairness was discussed. The executive order that promised integration arrived 3 years after the war ended. Issued in the language of policy, it was lived in the slow pressure of daily work. At bases, in training squadrons, in the tired corners of barracks where old assumptions did their last. Stubborn work. Some men flew in Korea, their experience a seam stitched from one conflict to the next. Jets, once fearsome rumor, became daily reality. The shapes changed. The math stayed a cousin to what they had learned in the war. Energy, angles, patience. The younger pilots came asking questions, some without any sense of how recently certain doors had been unlocked. That ignorance itself was a victory, if a complicated one. Unlearning takes longer than learning. It winds through institutions, through habits, through family stories spoken softly to children. In classrooms, the airman's service became a chapter. In communities, it became a point of pride, sometimes for the men themselves, sometimes for people who had once been indifferent, now eager to be associated with success. Films and books arrived in cycles. Each time, a new angle on the old courage, a new focus on the friction between reality and myth. Some took too many liberties. Some hewed closely to the ledger of missions and names. The airmen, those still here, watched with the complicated gaze of anyone who has lived through a story and then sees it retold. They winced at anachronisms. They smiled at small accuracies. The way a pilot rests his hand on the panel before takeoff, as if making a pact. The way ground crews talk to engines under their breath, as if it helps. Citizens who had never flown found something for themselves in the story. A reassurance that excellence can come from anywhere, that grit and training can break through stubborn ceilings. The long unlearning worked on 1,000 fronts, in hiring decisions, in school budgets, in the choice to give a kid a second glance rather than none at all. The airman's record sat behind these decisions like a quiet argument that did not tire. The sky changed. Fighters pushed past sound, then multiples of it. Avionics arrived with their cold, perfect logic. Checklists grew longer, then digitized. Yet a pilot's hands still met a machine's will in a place where physics and judgment shook hands. The Red Tail's legacy lived there, in the transmission of standards from instructor to student, from veteran to recruit. Some of the men became mentors in formal programs, others informally, one conversation at a time. They told younger pilots the same central truth. The mission comes first. Your skill exists to serve something larger than your reputation. The young ones nodded. The older ones remembered the cost of learning it. The paints changed. The aluminum skins gave way to composites, to radar-absorbent coatings that looked like the future drew itself in matte. Still, on special days, a unit would splash a tail red to honor history. It looked less like nostalgia than engineering morale, an applied link to a lineage that steadied hands and sharpened eyes. Beyond the military, the legacy seeped into airfields large and small, into university labs, into hangars where apprentices learned how to coax power from reluctant engines. The echo of those wartime years vibrated in scholarship funds, in STEM programs, in the decision of a teenager to aim high because someone before them had flown higher than anyone expected. Ask a man who flew why the sky still pulls at him, and he might say the obvious. It is beautiful, but beauty was never the whole answer. The sky is where they learned to be exact, to be brave without flourish, to be accountable to a team that trusted them with its life. The echo in the sky is the memory of that kind of life. It calls not for glory, but for readiness. On certain evenings, when the light thins and contrails fade into pink threads, a person on the ground can look up and imagine the shape of a formation, the instinctive geometry of protection. They can imagine the discipline it took to hold position when every nerve screamed to pursue. They can imagine a pilot counting the beats between a decision and its consequence. History is too often a list of what went wrong. The Red Tails, through discipline, through skill, through the refusal to be what they were told they were, added to the list of what went right. The Luftwaffe learned that new machines cannot change the fundamentals. The world learned, or began to learn, that excellence does not ask permission from prejudice. The echo is not loud. It doesn't need to be. It's there whenever a student nails a tough problem and looks up with that quiet, shocked smile. It's in the way a unit moves with synchrony born of trust. It's in the choice to hold the line rather than seek a headline. It's in the red of a painted tail, bright against the morning, stitching the present to the past and the future to a set of values that keep men and women steady when the wind picks up and the margins go thin. That echo, once you hear it, is impossible to unhear. It sounds like air being cut cleanly by purpose. It sounds like coming home.